glass up high. Turn it up, it's time. Tall boy on the line. Loud breeze, they will laugh. Raise your glass up high.
Welcome back to episode 349 of the Tall Boy Radio podcast. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, that beer is flowing in another very interesting direction as we're sharing some thin blue stories from police officers or officers who have served in the United States. And this story, well, it's a bit of a doozy. It's one that Gaz will be very, very sorry to miss out on. He's not here tonight. He's still on his holidays in Italy, so his microphone stand is here in the corner, like Tiny Tim's crutch from A Christmas Carol, we could say. But never fear, I'm joined by another co-host. You'll be familiar with him. It's my cousin Bo from San Antonio. How are you doing, dude?
I'm doing great. It's about time. I mean, all these law enforcement officials you have on here, and this is the first time you're asking me on. So I can, grill them on some questions. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you asking me.
Well, I thought as soon as I started reading the story and listening to the episodes they've done, especially the one they did with our good friend Vic Ferrari, I thought, This is going to be right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I think it is. And just a little bit that I've heard so far, I mean, this is going to go in so many different ways. I'm excited. And I got to get the book too. So
yeah, definitely.
I appreciate you letting me do this.
Oh, no, absolute honor. Like we say, there's a book to go along with it as well. So these two gentlemen wrote a book, Face to Face with Whtey Bulger. And if that doesn't just put it out there as just how interesting this episode is going to be, well, what else will? Well, let's find out as we introduce the two gentlemen involved. So, Bob, Rich, I'll let you take it in turns as to who wants to go first.
Well, my name is Bob Ward. I am a reporter, long-time reporter in Boston for WFXT-TV, which is the Fox affiliate in Boston. I've been there since 1996. I covered Whtey Bulger over the years, especially his years, and I covered his trial back in 2013, and kind of my back in the world of Whtey Bulger.
Yeah, incredible. Well, I mean, that's the name is utterly, like we said at the start, synonymous with the world of crime. So, Rich, did you want to tell us a little bit about the hand that you played in it as well?
Sure. I became an FBI agent in 1991. My father was a state trooper in Massachusetts, and my son is a Boston policeman right now. So it's kind of a legacy in the family type thing. But I was first assigned to the state of Connecticut and for 10 years. And my assignment was to the Connecticut Violent Crimes Fugitive Task Force. So, we were doing apprehensions for a better part of my 10 years there. And that's where I learned how to hunt people is through those assignments, and with some great cases, along the way. Another top 10 was grabbed in New York City when I had the case in Connecticut. He was a Jamaican kid wanted for a bunch of murders, and he was hiding out in New York City, and the FBI grabbed him down there and brought him back. So I worked on some pretty significant cases, and which translated into my ultimate assignment to the Boston FBI office in 2006. And I was assigned to the Whtey Bulger fugitive investigation. And when I came to the case, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but there was a lot of distrust between law enforcement agencies, specifically the Massachusetts State Police, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the FBI through years of trying to co-opt each other on investigating Whtey Bulger. And as my good friend Bob Ward says, while law enforcement was fighting, Bulger ran right up the middle of the field and got away. And he really should have been caught, much earlier than he was. But I worked the case from 2006 right until my retirement in 2017. And, there's still, and we'll get into this, on the financial side of it, but it was a fascinating career for me. And the ultimate was to debrief him and interrogate him on that aircraft for, unimpeded 6-hour plane ride across the United States. It was just the most cool thing you could ever do as an investigator, to be able to see who you chased for better part of 5 years, and finally get to ask him anything I wanted. He waived his his right to an attorney. So there you have it. There's where I'm at. I'm currently in law enforcement. I work for a sheriff's department up in northern Massachusetts as a internal investigator, and pretty fascinating job too. It's really the internal investigation side of investigating inmates and staff, correctional officer staff, things like that. So I still have my hand in the game, so to speak, but it wasn't as epic as my FBI career was.
Well, that's going to be difficult to match, isn't it? Let's be honest. Sitting down for 6 hours uninterrupted with someone like Whtey Bulger, you should have known you were never going to top that. I'm afraid that is incredible. That is incredible.
No.
So just for our UK listeners as well, which we do have plenty. There are plenty listed in many of the other countries, and I know USA is our second most popular spot. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between the FBI and how that's different from serving as a regular police officer?
Sure. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is the domestic law enforcement side federally in the United States. We investigate completely different crimes than local and state agencies do. It's more often large conspiracies where the FBI has so many resources across the world that typically we concentrate on large groups of criminals working together in a RICO conspiracy. But we do, somewhere in the neighborhood of 255 violations that we address, across the spectrum of counterintelligence, of counterterrorism, of violent crimes, cybercrime, which is probably the hottest topic in crime, in the crime world now. And so, you can, the beauty of the FBI is you can go do all of those type of assignments across your career. I chose, to chase fugitives and do violent crime work. And, I investigated, large groups of gangs operating here, in the Boston area. And we would do large RICO conspiracies on them. And our conspiracy cases typically last anywhere from 18 to 24 months before we indict the whole group. And I'll give you some examples. We did, I don't know if you've heard about the Latin Kings, but the Latin Kings is a Spanish group that operates all over the United States, but they're specifically headquartered in Chicago. And they operate across the US, and they had a large statewide group here in Massachusetts. And it took us better part of 2 to 3 years to put a bow on that one, meaning to indict them across the United States. We indicted everybody on a large murder conspiracy case, and we arrested probably in the neighborhood of 55 to 60 people, and other South American groups and also street gangs here that operate here in the large cities that may not be affiliated with a national gang, but are operating as a gang would, in a large scale conspiracy. So the difference between the federal side is we do larger groups and we do more of it across the US. But we also need our state and local partners because they have all of the on the ground knowledge, and we do not. That's just a fact. Yeah. And when I started out in Connecticut, I didn't know anything about Connecticut, and I had to rely on local police, New Haven police, and whatever city we were in, and the state police as well, because they had a network all over the state. And so when you put those pieces together, you put the federal side, and you put the state troopers, and then you put the local police, and then you put probation and parole, which is a big deal here in the U.S. It's a powerful group that can really knock these guys off, and that's what we did with the Bulger case. We did operate with the state police, but I can get into it's just a very long, complicated relationship between the state police and the FBI here in Boston. A lot of corruption, across local, state, and federal. We had 2 FBI agents that were corrupt and they were taking money from Bulger, and they were giving him information and compromising cases. And it just was an ugly affair. And Bob, you can speak on this topic as well as I can, but that's the difference in the structure between law enforcement here.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that with us. So yeah, Bob, from your perspective, sharing it from the media, what's it like when you're chasing cases like this, when you know there's a public interest in Bulger and what he's doing? He's a fugitive, he's on the most wanted list. You've got a captive audience. What's it like sharing that out with the world?
The most difficult thing is to try out information from people who are hunting a guy like Whtey Bulger. And back then, what I remember was I would talk to the FBI. I didn't know Rich back then, but there were other people at the FBI that I was dealing with, and try to get something from them, some nugget or something about citing anything at all. And that went on for years. And then I would be doing other stories with the state police, and they wouldn't go on the record their thoughts, but their distrust of the FBI was genuine. They did not like the FBI. They didn't trust them, and they had good reason to feel that way. So I say he would have been caught maybe a year or two after he took off, but he was gone for almost 7 years. And for most of that time, because the two chief agencies that were hunting down, the FBI and Massachusetts police, were not meshing. They were actually doing the opposite. It was really only at the end. I think after Rich came on, and there were FBI agents who had nothing to do with John Connell corruption from more. There was a big turnover in the Boston office. Once that happened, I think some tensions frosted, relations improved, and then they finally got to work. But it was really something.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that I'd read, one of the things I'd seen was about the police corruption, that this guy was basically surviving out on the run because he was being tipped off. He was getting information, when you guys were getting closer to him. Well, he knew that information was gifted to him. Well, not gifted to him. I'm sure it came at a very nice fee for those gentlemen involved. But yeah, wow, that's shocking. So how did you get involved with the case originally then, Rich? How did that call come about?
I knew a lot of people from Connecticut, the Connecticut office, who had transferred to Boston. It's a short ride across state lines for about 2 hours from Connecticut to Massachusetts. And people had heard I was going to be, assigned to Boston. It took me 15 years to get back home. I was born and raised in a place called Quincy, Massachusetts, which is just south of Boston. And I did, people knew what I did in Connecticut, and they knew how successful we were. And so my boss, he called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to work the Whtey Bulger case?" And I had already done my homework. I knew there was tension up here, and I knew my relationships with police agencies in Connecticut were so much diametrically different than, back in Boston. And I remember calling a friend of mine who was a bomb technician, and he got transferred up to Boston before I did. And I call him up. I'm like, "Eddie, tell me what's going on up there." And he's like, "Rich, it's a mess. You don't want to come here. You don't want to work this case. You're going to be miserable." And when I first said it to him, I said, "I'm going to be working Whitey." And he's like, "Careful for what you wish for, Rich, because you're in for it." And so, I took that with a grain of salt. And, when I was first assigned to the case, I read the entire case file, and all of the investigators, I just questioned. Probably thought I was a pain in the rear, but I wanted to learn about the case. There was so much, it was such a complicated case between the Bulger family and all of his Winter Hill associates. And everybody in South Boston at that time did not want to cooperate with the FBI. Nobody. And the Bulger family had a blanket coverage of a high-powered attorney in Boston. And so when we would try and talk to the family, they would just go talk to my attorney. And that's how I became involved in it. And it was, we were really focusing on Whitey, and right up to the time that we shifted gears, and we can get into that as we go along. But it was all focused on Whitey. What we were receiving hundreds, if not thousands, of tips every year. We would put them on traditional, crime shows, America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries at the time when that was on. And we would profile media, very controlled media, in the US on him. And really the turning point, and we can get into this with the whole Billy Bulger thing, but I think that we finally found I think we shifted focus on the girlfriend, and I can get into the public service announcement that we created, and that's what caught him. That's ultimately what caught him. The traditional media and traditional coverage by America's Most Wanted was not going to do it for us. And but at the time when I was first assigned, it was all about knocking on doors and traditional law enforcement techniques. And just to give you perspective of how big this case was, literally we had volumes of investigative documents in a vault in our offsite space on the other side of Boston. And the reason why we were offsite is because we wanted to be free of any type of interference from the FBI at the time, because we didn't know who to trust. And that was before I got there, but it was moved because it needed to be independent of the Boston office because of John Connolly's connections, who was an FBI agent who was compromised, and John Morris, who was assigned as Connolly's supervisor. And they were part of an organized crime squad called C3. And the original fugitive case sat with the organized crime guys. And that's why he wasn't caught in 1995, 1996, is because they were doing long-term surveillance on him. He needed to be caught right away. And those guys don't work that way. They work long-term cases, like I mentioned before. And that was when the Bulger Task Force was formed up and decided that fugitive side of the case was going to be carved off of the larger case, which was the RICO indictment of Whtey Bulger. And so
could I just say something, Rich?
Yeah.
One of the things I think sets this case apart is that corruption in the FBI office that pretty much destroyed its reputation, not just in Boston, but nationally. This is before I got there. John Connolly was a guy, an FBI agent, rose to fame because he was taking down the Italian mafia in Boston, largely from information that he got from Whitey and his partner Fleming. But those two were his top echelon informants. And while every other organized crime figure in Boston was being taken down, Whtey Bulger, even Fleming and that crew was left unscathed. Whitey had his brother, Bulger was the president of the Senate. Very powerful, probably more powerful than the governor of Massachusetts at that time. And nobody wanted to cross their path. So you have an FBI agent, his supervisor in the pocket of the most notorious mob boss in Boston, who is the brother of one of the most powerful politicians in Boston. All of that coming to the surface at the time Whitey took off. Whitey was given the heads up by John Connolly. The state police were tasked with judging Stephen, the rifleman, partner. They caught him right away. Fleming did not take off, but Whitey did. And when the FBI came back, started talking to their partner, police, where is Whtey Bulger? Don't know. We'll get him. We'll figure it out. And that went on for basically 17 years. So it can't be overstated how much distrust there was for the FBI at that time. Not only among law enforcement, but with the press. And the press was brutal on the FBI. And you can see. And so Rich got in there. He had to deal with the relationship with the other agencies, but also the press and public opinion. And people thought the FBI didn't want to catch Whtey Bulger. The thought was that he was going to take the entire Boston FBI office down with him. He's going to name names. So in the Boston office, The guys that were working on the case, they got moved out of the building into another building, into a secure facility where all the evidence had to be passcoded for access to the files, so that some flunky at the FBI couldn't just kind of open up a file and see what's in there and pass along information to Whitey or one of the underlings. The paranoid, I should say, was real, and trust was real outside of the FBI and on the inside of the FBI. And that's what Richard found himself in the middle of. Said, why don't you come up to Boston and hit up this investigation?
Yeah. So Rich, when you first got assigned to Whtey Bulger case, or when you were moving over to Whtey Bulger case, did you know the FBI was compromised at that time, or is that something you found out later on? I mean, you were taking a big step, going that direction. Did you already know that there was people on the inside that were taking money?
Yeah. I mean, with my connection to Connecticut, with Boston being right up the street, really, for lack of a better term, I had heard, and I had friends of mine that transferred up here way before I did, and I had heard about Connolly and Morris, and when I came, I was really apprehensive about coming to this case. I really was, because it was like a no-win situation, and I went from multiple wins, working big cases in Connecticut where the cooperation was phenomenal. And, you would have an occasional turf battle here and there. You get somebody that didn't want a case, didn't want to work a case with you. And that just happens. But I was really apprehensive. It's a really good question, because I was really nervous about coming to this case, because I knew I was going to be up against it, both with elements in the office, with, the state police, who my father was a lieutenant. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in the state police and had a stellar reputation. And he was alive at that time. He told me, you're crazy to go to that case, because you're going to have a case of anxiety with it, because nobody will cooperate with you. And that was 100% true. I was really up against it. And, when I came to the case, people were really gun shy about talking to the press about what they were going to share for information with other agencies. And we kept it together as a tight-knit group.
They were screaming at each other. So the next day I happened to be working on the story. It's a public information officer talking
and get beaten up and just take it. And I wasn't going to do that. I was, I would get permission to do it from the office, and they were like, sure, go for it, and so I engaged the press, and we would do off the record, and I could only answer what what wasn't sensitive. I couldn't reveal any investigative techniques that we were using, but short of that, I would engage with the press that was beating us up, and I would just say, listen, ask me any question you want. I will answer as best as I can within the confines of my agency's policy on speaking on press matters. And the public affairs officer would be right there with me, and I would just say to, these guys that were hammering us, I would just say, listen, I'm here to tell you right now that we are, as an agency, trying to find him. And they were like, we don't believe you. We think you sometimes want to find him. I'm like, no, that's not the case. We want to find him. And Bob's right. Like, we had to find him. And that
Kamala White, Stanley, she gets bored on the road. He drops her back off. Killer, drops her back off. He picks up Catherine and Greg, and then they're gone. And one of the interesting things for me in writing this book and working with Rich is seeing exactly where he was when he left Boston. And he was just outside of reach. I can see why it took such a long time to find him. Half the time where he was going. It's not like he was hiding out with a small army of hard trained guns and everything. Like some big crime boss, I think when he's opponent or the Italian New York City. Just him, a woman, and he had a lot of reasons. And he had his intelligence. He got by on his knew the streets, knew how to survive. So you were up against a formidable enemy. but you had the pressure of time against you and expectation of the public.
True.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. So Rich, were there any verified close calls catching him? I mean, that hey, we just missed him by 10 minutes, or was there anything like that, or was it you had no idea he could have been in the area or he couldn't have been in the area?
Yeah, it's the case was so large and it had gone on for so long. I think that there was a sighting in Taormina, Sicily, of a couple that were vacationing in Taormina, and it looked like it was a DEA agent that shot the video and sent it back to the Boston office. And we actually went over to Rome and investigated it, and the Carabinieri over there investigated it for us, and we couldn't identify this couple, and we had really good photographs and video, and I thought it was a pretty good sighting, and it was about the age of Bulger, and they were traveling in a very tourist-filled location. I thought it could have been him. And we went on German TV, and we traveled all over Europe to try and identify this couple. And this was around 2007, 2008. And we ultimately did, through doing, what would be the equivalent of America's Most Wanted. It's a live German television show. So, I'm speaking English, but they're translating in German for me, and we ultimately identified them from that show as a German couple, and we profiled their picture all over the world. And the couple wound up suing the television station for invasion of their privacy. And I think it was a $50,000 settlement, and I'm like, that's a heavy price to pay for a lookalike sighting. But there were no, in my mind at the time, I thought there were close calls. I thought there were a couple of leads in Mexico, and as I mentioned before, I think the only closest time and I wasn't even on the case then, would be in 1995 down in Selden, New York. The FBI should have had him then, maybe even into early 1996. But he was down in Selden hiding out, and he was using the alias Tom Baxter, and he was with Kevin Weeks, who was his enforcer back here in Boston. He was with his aunt, and Nadine Matos, and they operated, they should have been caught then, both of them. And so, to answer your question, it was before my time, but that was when he should have been caught.
And there was also another time, maybe it's the same thing, when there was an attempt to get raw material, fake IDs, Whitey, Kevin Weeks.
Yeah,
it's all detailed in the book, and it's complicated, but this is what the state police with their own, a couple of officers in the state police, undercover guys, organized crime guys. They had the plan that if they got the raw material for a fake ID of Whitey, he used it in ID and got pulled over for speeding or got a passport with it. He red flag, and they'd be able to catch Whtey Bulger. But it was like on cops because it was just state police, no federal partners, and they lost the guy. They lost the handoff, and if they had the resource, they could have followed that source, who took Amtrak to New York, handed the Whtey Bulger waiting, but it never happened. But I don't think there's anything like you're asking where, oh man, if we were 10 minutes earlier, we would have caught him. I don't think that ever happened. By the time the sightings came up, they used to put the media. Like I don't know. It was maybe 12 sightings over the length of the case that were verified, and then they would release media of a banner where Whitey head on spots in the U.S. By the time that us in the press, those sightings had to be months old, not a year old. So they were very at least publicly not even close.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I wanted to say a quick hello to Big Titty in Oklahoma, who's joining and listening in, who's dropped a message to say he's very much enjoying it. So one of the questions I wanted to ask then, Rich, you mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of there was a lot of tip-offs, literally thousands and thousands of tip-offs coming in. So when that Santa Monica tip-off came in, did it feel different? Was it different? Was there a different feel about it?
So, I'll back up and just say that with the evolution of the case after I came to it, there became a point where we needed to shift focus on to Catherine, and we did that in 2010, and ultimately into 2011. And what we did, which is detailed in the book, but it was pretty innovative stuff at the time, is we had sat in a conference room and decided we were going to shift focus because we weren't getting anywhere with him, but we wanted to try and do something with her and focus on the daytime TV demographic, the female audience that was home watching Oprah and other things like that. And what we did is we got a $50,000 budget and we created our own public service announcement. And we had gotten these very, very good digitally enhanced photos of some dental photos that Catherine had done prior, years ago when she was younger, but they were so crystal clear. We really never had a good picture of her, and for that matter, Bulger, really. And so we used those to target plastic surgery associations across the United States and dental associations. And we got some leads out of that, but what we created was a 30-second public service announcement focused on her. And it was just a public affairs officer saying, have you seen these two people? There were James Whtey Bulger, he's wanted for RICO murder. And we focused on selling or buying TV markets in 14 cities that we had leads in. And so the PSA appeared on June 20th, 2011. We had a command center set up in Center Plaza where the Boston office was at the time. And we had a 24 staffed command post taking leads, in regard to the generation of that PSA. And we received a good lead in Biloxi on the 21st, shook it out, wound up to be a lookalike. And then I came into work on the early morning of the 22nd, and I would review all the tips that came in, because the tips would get called into a central repository in West Virginia, and then they would get farmed out to whatever affected field office. So in this case, we got a tip in Santa Monica. The tip went to the LA office, but it also came to the Boston office because we were the office of origin. And so I looked at it, and it was, Charlie and Carol Gasco, very specific information, and so specific that the tipster befriended Catherine Gregg, aka Carol Gasco. They connected through a stray cat that was living out in front of their apartment building, and Catherine would feed the cat and take care of it. And the tipster, struck up a friendship with her. And so that, a person called in from another country, and it's if you want to know who the tipster is, you can find it online. But I'm not gonna say, because I promised this person anonymity, and you're never gonna hear it from me who that person is. But suffice it to say that it got leaked here in the U.S. and it caused me great, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails from this person who was genuinely scared, and I had to walk them off the ledge, so to speak. But the tip came in and it looked very specific. We started running like public source database checks, and it wasn't coming back to anything. And so I called a friend of mine who's an FBI agent in LA. His name's Scott Garriola, and this was probably around 10 a.m. my time, maybe a little later. And I just called him, and he's like, Rich, I'm on vacation. I'm like, dude, you have to do this for me. You have to, because there were a couple other investigators, and they were like, this looks pretty good. Like, it confirmed it for me. And And so he did it. He formed up his guys, LAPD guys and other FBI agents, and he came up with a ruse to get Bulger out of there. He had the apartment manager, who went to Boston University, by the way, and didn't know who Bulger was. I don't know about that, but anyway, we got him, or Scott got him to call up Bulger and tell him his storage locker in the apartment building had been broken into, and for him to come down and tell us so that we could file a police report. He comes right down. He's dressed in all white, white pants, white shirt, white fishing hat. He's got a beard, and he comes out of the elevator not thinking twice about it. And Scott says, you're under arrest. Identify yourself. Fuck you. You go identify yourself. And so it's a FU match, back and forth. And so Scott told him, get down on the ground, get down on the ground. He's like, no, I'm not getting down on the ground, because there was oil from cars that were on the floor and he didn't want to get dirty, which was that's nuts. But anyway, he was very compliant. He was arrested without incident. He showed Scott and his team where all the guns were, where all the ammunition was, where all the money was hidden. And he just wanted consideration for Catherine Gregg. He didn't want her to be charged for harboring. And we'll get into that on the plane ride. But it was such a good feeling to catch him in that way, and for us as an agency for lack of a better term, redemption. It really was. And I had so much satisfaction from being able to call up people who had no belief that that commercial was going to work, and I got a call. I called up the prosecutor on the case, and his name was James. And I'm like, hey, we're doing this public service announcement. He's like, Rich, you've done this before. This is over and over again. You're not gonna catch him. And so after we caught him, I call up James. I'm like, it fucking worked, man.
Brilliant.
So I don't mean to swear on here, but it was that kind of elation that I had, we got it done. It was a breath of fresh air to finally close that down. But yeah,
that's brilliant. Yeah, you must have felt absolutely elated, going into the task that was, I'm not going to say make or break, but potentially, it was almost a no-win situation, and to actually come out of it with a W, it must be an incredible feeling.
Yeah, it was high fives by everyone, because it was it's got such a nasty history to it that finally, we were able to redeem us and redeem the office in some respect, and get from a reputational perspective, we did it, and we did it our way, and nobody helped us do it. And I was glad, that I came to the case, after he was captured. But the ride along the way to get to the lead up to the apprehension was no fun. Absolutely no fun. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
Well, having you knew that there were people in the FBI that were working with him. Did you have any apprehension whatsoever when somebody across the country would say, "Hey, we think he's over here," and you had to call somebody else to go check on them? Did you have any apprehension that person too may be on the books? Or because I know at that point you're probably keeping a lot of stuff close to vest and you don't want it getting out.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, when I came to the case in 2006, I firmly believed, and this is my own belief through time and through my partners that I worked with in the task force, that it really the only corruption was John Connolly and John Morris with deliberately taking money from gangsters. And there were other elements in that C3 squad that I mentioned, that organized crime squad. They were leftover remnants, people in that squad that maybe had some sympathy for John Connolly. And I certainly didn't. I wanted to build, and I'll just set it up for you. Connolly retired from the FBI in 1990, and he went to work for a utility company here in Boston. And I was firmly convinced he was in touch with Bulger because Bulger fled in 1995. And so I wanted to build a harboring case on Connolly, and I tried, and I couldn't do it. They had charged Connolly in 2000 with perjury and obstruction on a separate federal case for his alliance with Bulger, and he wound up doing 10 years in federal prison for it. And then he was indicted by the state of Florida for second-degree murder for a murder that happened down there of John Callahan, and so he was charged and convicted. And Bob can attest to it. He got out on some kind of medical release from state prison because of cancer, and he's still kicking today up here in Massachusetts. So I to answer your question, Bo, I thought that it ended there with those two. And I'll fast forward for a minute. When I brought him back to Boston, the FBI director came to town to do a ribbon cutting for the Boston Joint Terrorism Task Force over at the airport. And he sat my partner Phil and I in a room and basically said, I want to know right now who else was involved in this. Did he name names? Who else was involved? And both Phil and I were like, nobody. It ended there. I mean, he had co-opted a state police trooper who had told him about some pen registers that we were doing on phones, compromised that investigation. And he had compromised other police in the city, but that was the extent of it. To answer your question, it was just Connolly and Morris, and I didn't believe anybody else was involved in that. I was comfortable with that, because if we had to send leads across the United States, I was perfectly comfortable with knowing that at the time it was going to be assigned to a fugitive squad, and it was going to go to a fugitive investigator, whether it be a Fed, a state, or a local police. They were deputized as task force members. They could investigate federal fugitives, and so I really didn't have an issue with it. I really didn't. I didn't even give it a think, really, after I got assigned to the case.
So before we get to that conversation on the plane journey and just how incredible it is you got that time to sit down and have a conversation with him, I've got to ask Bob, as someone who covered this case, what would you have given to have been on that plane and have that conversation?
I would have given anything. My first question to Rich was, "Where's the audio tape? I want to hear his voice. I want to hear how you guys interacted." And there is no audio tape. There's no video tape. It's just Rich's notes and report that he wrote with Phil, and that's it. That's it. Oh my God! I would. He did not take a stand in his trial. He was given the opportunity, and he stood up and said, "This is all a sham." Whatever. I remember that. This is a sham. Probably threw an F-bomb at the judge, and that was it. I would give anything to be there, throwing a question or two.
I'll bet. And that's it. And that's the curiosity of this case. So Rich, tell us a little bit about that then, because to get that opportunity, 6 hours on a plane flight to talk to one of the most notorious men in America's history, certainly the criminal history, that's a gift. That really is a gift.
Yeah, I'll set it up in this way. When my friend Scott called me, I was at home, and I was running a gang squad and the Bulger task force as well simultaneously. And I got a text from Scott. He's like, "Looking good," and I'm like, "What the hell does looking good mean?" And then so I texted him back, and I'm like, "Give me more." And he didn't text me back for what seemed like ages. And he texts back and he says, "Bulger in custody. Stand by for Catherine." I took my phone. My kids were young. I took my phone, threw it across the room, and I just jumped for joy. I'm like, yes, and a couple adjectives thrown in there, as you will.
F-bomb.
And a lot of F-bombs. And my kids were young, so they, "Dad, you shouldn't be talking like that." And
Rich,
so,
can I just say, so that night, the news broke to us around midnight, and it came out of LA So people there in Boston, we didn't break the news. Came from the West Coast this way. I was on my way home, my night shift, and somebody gave me a call. I called somebody. I don't remember who I called. It wasn't Rich. Confirm the news. Turn around. Went back to work. Had the great experience of calling my boss in their home and waking up and saying, "Whitey Bulger, gotta get back to work." But the reason I say this is we were owned, and my television station was owned by Fox. We've since sold, but we owned a radio station in Los Angeles. So one of their or anchors, whatever, called our station just to get some reaction at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I took the call, and I remember the person asked me what reaction be in Boston when people wake up. And the only thing I could think of, I was still in a state of shock. I said, it's going to be like an atomic bomb just from Boston. I said, this is going to be incredible. We're all waiting for it. Who is Whitey going to name? Nobody's going to happen. Who is in on with him? It's going to be the biggest story you've ever seen. And it did turn out to be the biggest story, even without him naming names. It was just a shock. I started thinking that the only way we would know what Whitey would be would die out there, and the members of the Bulgers, the big Irish family, would all be seen on various planes going to the place, and that's how somebody figure out and Whtey Bulger's dead, and there'd be no stories or anything. But I never thought. I was getting to the point where he's going to be 80, old man, can't live forever. It's just going to be. What's that guy? Cooper. D.W. Cooper. Jumped out of the plane. That's what Whtey Bulger's going to be like. Yeah, already another unsolved mystery in Boston. The Gardner Heights. Nobody knows what those paintings figured. Well, it figures Whtey Bulger will be like Gardner Heights, and this will be the world's unsolved crimes. So, but they actually got him, and it was a shock, real shock.
Incredible.
Yeah, he was. I that night he was captured. I tried to get a government aircraft out that night, and the Gulfstream 5 wasn't available. It was in the Mideast at the time, and we had 2 Department of Justice owned aircraft to transport, both people and evidence if need be, utilized by the Department of Justice, but also by the FBI. And we had FBI pilots flying it who were, agents. And so I took a commercial flight out the next morning with a guy by the name of Phil Torsney, who interviewed Bulger with me, and Neil Sullivan, who was a deputy U.S. Marshal that had recently been assigned to us. And we flew out to LAX, got to the courthouse, got there in time to see his initial appearance. And prior to that, I walked down into the Marshal's lockup, and I went face to face with Whtey Bulger there. And he wasn't like the violent criminal that I had been chasing. He looked like a meek old man who he really did look beaten. And it was hot. I remember it was hot, really humid out there. And I was walking down the hallway, and it was like this crazy smell of ammonia. I guess they had just cleaned the lockup, and they pour ammonia in water and just, but it was a real strong smell. But I got to his cell, and I'm like, I identified myself, and so did Phil. And he was like, I just want consideration for Catherine. And I'm like, I can't confirm that. That's levels way above me. And he's like, well, I'll tell you anything you want if you give her consideration. And I'm like, I'll check for you. He said the same thing on the plane, but he looked beaten down. And I should note that he did see the PSA himself in Santa Monica. And he told me on the plane, he's like, you guys finally focused on her. And he knew he had been had. I think in his mind, Bob and I talk about it all the time. I think it had come time for him where he was tired, and if he got caught fair and square, then he would he'd be okay with it. But on the flip side of it, hypothetically speaking, as a law enforcement mind, what if he didn't come down to that storage locker? And what if he barricaded himself in that apartment? And what if he shot it out with the FBI, or held her hostage pending whatever kind of negotiation they would have from a crisis negotiation standpoint? And so I look back on that and I'm like, whew, did we jump through an obstacle there? Because he could have been pissed, and he could have just said, no.
Yeah.
I'm not going.
It's interesting that he fell for this. He's so meticulous with IDs and cashing in his money, getting money, being careful where he was, how he was seen. The ruse to get him out of the apartment is kind of the oldest trick in the book.
Yeah,
we kind of think that. Maybe he let his guard down because, like you said, Rich was tired. He was in his early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. His crew had all turned against him. There was nothing left for him in Boston except for his family.
Yeah.
And he was not living the high life. He was living in a rent-controlled two-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
Granted, you're in California. You're on the beach. It's beautiful. But it's not like they were going out to restaurants and hanging out every day, enjoying their lives, nice cocktails. They were in a kind of themselves. He was paranoid. He was always looking over his shoulder. He had been doing that for a very, very long time. And you know what's funny, Rich? Part of this, when you mentioned that he saw the PSA as something going to happen. We found out from research that the FBI was able to show that the very first time America's Most Wanted featured Whtey Bulger, the case, Whitey and Marisa Stanley were watching the show in a hotel in New York. So bookends, doesn't it? Both ends. He knew he was aware, very much aware. The slightest mistake could cost him. And that has to wear a man down. Even though he had $822,000 in cash in a hole in the apartment he dug out with their hands, even though he had an arsenal of weapons, assault rifles, pistols, a knife, hand grenade, also cut into the walls. I mean, he was ready for doomsday. He had to. But in the end, he just fell for the oldest ruse in the book. Come down to the basement, broke into his storage locker. Check this out. And there's the FBI waiting for them.
Wow. Well, he was trying to buy Josh Bond. Josh Bond was the apartment manager, and him and Bulger struck up a friendship. And there's been part of the investigation that has said that Bulger was bisexual, and I think he was trying to co-opt Josh Bond, who's a musician out in L.A. But he's the manager for that apartment. So Bulger didn't even think twice about going down because he believed Josh. And, Josh got paid $150,000 by the U.S. government as a reward. So, he was helpful to us. Don't get me wrong. But he fell for, you're right, Bob. He fell for the oldest trick in the book. That's such a routine thing to do. And, and he bit hook, line, and sinker on it. But to just set it up, that when we got into the plane, when he was brought, I was there so we flew him home on a very comfortable G5, Gulfstream 5 aircraft. It probably sits about 10 comfortable, but it could seat up to 15, 20 people, and leather seating, very, very, very nicely done. $40 million aircraft. And I had flown on it with the director when I was assigned to the executive protection side of things in Washington, D.C. after my time in Connecticut. And I was intimately familiar with that airplane, and I wanted that airplane to debrief him. And just like Bob had said, my intent was to record that interview. The Department of Justice had recently, back in 2010, had allowed interrogations and interviews to be recorded. We were never allowed to do that prior to that year. We were always had to do what's called an FD 302, which is basically a report, a factual based report, no opinions, just the facts, man. And we would reduce it to writing and take copious amounts of notes. So that's the way I was trained. But I didn't have time to get a recorder. I really didn't. And I'm so glad I didn't, because think about it. If I had recorded it and I got back to Boston and the U.S. Attorney's Office starts asking me for it, and then they leak it to the press, and then somebody else leaks it, in the office or whatever, somebody's owed a favor or whatever, I would have got absolutely crushed for that, because I would have had the equipment and I would have been blamed for, passing it to the wrong people. But so I'm so glad I didn't, record it. It would have been nice, to visualize him. But I think I explain him pretty good in the book. And I think that, the 6 hours is a long time to spend with someone. And, I got to know him. And, he was definitely a hard interview because he wanted to control the conversation. He wanted to shape the narrative. He hadn't spoken to anybody about his life on the run for better part of 15, 16 years. He could only talk to Catherine Gregg. And so he did a brain dump for us on that plane. And right up front, I asked him, I gave him a form. I said, Mr. Bulger, do you want to waive your rights to an attorney? Yep. So he signs the form, and I could ask him anything I wanted.
Amazing.
Everything was fair game. But the way we had set up to do the interview was we didn't care about the underlying crimes. We did care, but I wasn't there to talk about his murders. I was there to talk about his life on the run. That was what my mission was. And so we based our questioning on that. Anybody that helped him, harbored him, was in contact with him, anybody that helped him in Santa Monica. And, he was a tough interview because he would only talk about people that were dead. And he would not talk about anybody that was alive. Like, I'll give you an example. I asked a question about Kevin Weeks and what his involvement was with Bulger's being a fugitive. Nope, I'm not answering that. You can ask Kevin. Same thing with Catherine. I'd ask a question, why did Catherine help you all those years? No, go talk to her. And he was tough. He was really tough. But the trick of what we were trying to do is to make sure he didn't shut down. And, if he invoked this right to an attorney at any time, I could not ask him another question. And he didn't. And so that it was really like on the edge, like how you had to handle him, because he'd get mad at some points during the interview. And he's like, why am I talking to you guys? Like, you arrested my brother, Jackie, and you made life miserable for him. And I'm like, I felt like saying, too bad, so sad, man. He was involved in helping you. And so but we would redirect him and get him back on talking about, what he deemed he could talk about. And at the time, he wanted consideration for John Connolly, who was in prison down in Florida, because he didn't know he was an informant when we arrested him. I can get into the informant rules and guidelines that the FBI had in place back then, but he didn't know he was a papered informant. He had an informant file that was about that thick, about yay thick. And he and his counterpart, Stephen Flemmy, were what's deemed top echelon informants, which are the top tier informants for the FBI source program, the confidential source program. And if you didn't pay your source, then you didn't have to tell him he was an informant. That's the guidelines that were in place at the time. And since Connolly was convicted and since everything came out, with court hearings and, non-disclosure agreements and all of that, the informant guidelines were completely rewritten because specifically of John Connolly's use of Whtey Bulger, or, lack of, because, Whitey really thought he was paying for information from John Connolly and John Morris. He didn't believe he was an FBI informant. It wasn't until he got back and they started prepping for trial that he saw all those documents attributed to him. And they're specific documents that are serialized in an informant file that are attributed to, they wouldn't say Whtey Bulger's name. They'd say, TE 5901, stated the following. And his information in his informant file very much mirrored what was in Fleming's file, because the FBI was targeting La Cosa Nostra during those years, during the 80s and the early 90s. And Fleming's information was valuable to obtaining indictments for LCN figures up here. And so I started reading through the files, and I'm like, these two files match. So Conley was papering Bulger and papering Fleming with the same information so that he could rise Whitey's status and use him, for forever if he could have. So it's amazing to see him as a person on the plane. He co-opted a lot of people and he killed a lot of people. And Bob and I don't, we don't, self-aggrandize him. He's a violent criminal, and right to the end. And so, but I went about that interview to try and keep him on task. And he told us quite a bit, but there would be times where he was very emotional, and you could tell his personality would switch, and he would go from, befriending a homeless guy named James Lawler in West LA in Santa Monica, buying his identity. And if you saw a picture of James Lawler and you saw a picture of Whtey Bulger, they looked exactly alike. Blue eyes, same facial structure, same approximate age. And Bulger bought his, got a license under his name. He used his car. He got him an apartment in West LA and paid for it for better part of 9 or 10 years. And Lawler ultimately died of a drug overdose, and he was a drunk and couldn't beat narcotics. And he was an Army vet, and Bulger was an Air Force vet. So they had a commonality, but when he died, Bulger had to walk away from that identity, and he had to walk away from that car. And the day he found out, Lawler died, he took a bottle of vodka and poured it all over the car and wiped it all down, fingerprints, and walked away and never went back. And when he was on the plane, he was talking about Lawler, and he started crying, like uncontrollably. And then, flip a switch 2 minutes later or 5 minutes later, and he's talking about, forced busing of African Americans in Boston back in the 70s. And he was a very racist guy, very racist. And I couldn't believe how many times he threw the N-word out. And I just thought, he's showing you true colors right now, man. You really are. So it was a case study in human behavior. And Bob, I wish you were on that plane because you could ask questions that maybe I wasn't thinking of. And
what I find interesting is how much he fought that idea that I'm not a rat. We heard that during the trial. And yet in the end, he was written down as an informant. He didn't know about it, and ultimately cost his life because the guys told him that was why they wanted him, because they thought he was a rat. And in the underworld, there's nothing worse than that. That was his undoing.
Yeah,
that's incredible. That is incredible, and it's like you say, it's an incredible story, and to be able to have that conversation with him, it sounds to me like he needed to have that conversation with somebody as well. Like it was a release of emotions, and there's two different sort of aspects. Well, I think we're all there's multifacets to all our personalities and all we are. And he had a lot to get off his chest. So
he did, and he had his apartment. Richard found a manuscript that Whitey was working on. Legal. He was writing his life story in it. It didn't get very far, but he wrote enough. And then also he had a library of books, and they were true crime books about the Boston mob. And he's just going through it. In the margins, Whitey is writing, "This is BS, liar," and he's trying to write his own thing. So I do believe that when he got on that plane, he used that as his opportunity to set his legacy or some twisted idea of letting the world know what was in his mind. Because he didn't do it in his trial. That would have been the perfect place for him to do that. To get up on the stand and under direct, just tell your life story. He did not take that opportunity. He also wrote some letters from prison, various people, and some of the things he wrote in those letters that we've seen mirrors what he told Rich. So it was definitely top of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Just out of interest then, obviously, because we know, like you say, he was deemed an informant, and that's basically what brought an end to his life. He was killed in prison. How did you feel when you got that news, the both of you?
I found out and I wasn't surprised, but yet I was, and I'll qualify that answer, is, when you have any type of cooperating witness in a federal case, and they are, going to be testifying, but they're in prison, and they've got charges of their own. Is we always ask the Bureau of Prisons, which is a federal agency, to do a threat assessment. Like if a guy has to be moved that I'm using in a RICO conspiracy gang trial, and he has to be moved because of either a safe keep, which means, he has keep froms. He has other inmates that can't have contact with him because he'll violence will occur. And so I was surprised that he was moved from, he was in Plymouth County Correctional here in Massachusetts. Then he was in federal prison in Florida. Then he was moved to Phoenix. And then I think he was back in Florida. And then ultimately he was moved to ADX Hazleton in West Virginia, which at the time he arrived at that institution was probably one of the most violent federal prisons in the country. And what I'm shocked at, I'm not shocked that he was killed in prison, but what I'm shocked at is that he didn't go to segregation. He went to general population, and he was killed within 6 hours of arriving at that prison. And it made me shake my head, because the Bureau of Prisons should have known that he would have had two Springfield gangsters that were in Hazleton that would take a crack at him, and they should have known that, and they should have known that he was ultimately going to be a threat in Hazleton. That's what I was surprised at, but I wasn't surprised that he got knocked off. I really wasn't. They killed him with socks and locks. They took metal locks, put him in socks, and bashed his brains in, and ripped out his eyes and cut out his tongue. And there were three guys. There was one lookout and two guys that were doing it in his cell. And so I was shocked by that when I heard it. But Bob?
Yeah, I was shocked too. Here's the thing. I don't advocate the murder of anyone, even Whtey Bulger. I'll just say that during the course of my time covering this, I became close to some of the victims' families. And I saw how this case, Whtey Bulger, the crew, the way the federal government with them, pretty much destroyed them. And I thought of them, and I think that the death of Whtey Bulger removed a cancer from Boston, because we didn't just have this serial killing sociopath mobster. We also had corruption power that involved the state government, his brother, and also the FBI. These are institutions that we depend upon and rely upon to live our lives. And if we can't trust these basic institutions that govern us, then we have chaos. We have nothing. And that was Whtey Bulger who was exploiting all of that. So the death of Whtey Bulger, the fact that he cannot hurt anyone else ever again, I think is a bright light that happened. As much as I hate to say, he was murdered in prison, and there are questions about this. He did not get the death penalty. He got a very lengthy sentence in federal prison. Somebody somewhere took it upon themselves to levy that capital punishment against Whtey Bulger, and that's not right either. I don't know if we're ever going to get an answer to that. That's an X-Files thing, along with the other legacy here. There's no way he only had $122,000 I sat through that trial. there's another part of it. There was the myth of Whitey. He's this noble Robin Hood guy who looked out for South Boston, kept the drugs out of Boston, and helped old ladies across the street. That was the biggest BS you could imagine. He was a vicious killer, and if anyone crossed the path, he would take action. If he saw anyone that had money that thought he should have, he would go for it. There's no way he only had $822,000. So before he became a fugitive, he was hiding safe deposit boxes in your backyard, Dublin, Piccadilly Circus. Rich thinks they're in Paris. He had them in the southeastern, southwestern part of the United States. Only some of those boxes have been found. There's more.
Yeah.
And that I think is the second part of the legacy of Bulger. Where is all that money, all that blood money he took from the streets of Boston?
True.
That's incredible. And like you say, when we hear about these crimes, you fixate on the perpetrator of them, and that's the person who gets your interest. And rightly so, we know it's interesting. So he was charged with 11 murders, I believe it's right. So we don't doubt that there was more victims than that. But not only that, like you said there, the families, when any murder is committed, there's more than one victim, because everybody who has to deal with that is a victim as well. They are a victim of his crime. And there's a lot of people who probably didn't shed much of a tear and maybe had a little bit of a smile and a little bit of relief when he was dealt with in the way that he was. And like you say, that sends a message. In fact, they took out his eyes and his tongue. It was very, very clear what they wanted to say when they did what they did to him. I have to ask, as a side, though, you mentioned it there, how did that money end up in Piccadilly? Like you say, Bo and myself were just down in London a little over 2 months ago. How did that money get down there?
He had it there before he became a fugitive. The account is under Tom Baxter, which is one of the early aliases he used, and he just liked to park money over in Europe. During his pre-fugitive years, he enjoyed going to Paris and England, and specifically to London and Dublin, and deep Irish connections to Ireland, and Bob's right though. Getting to know him over a 6-hour plane ride, you get to know somebody pretty good, and judging by Bulger's MO, if he ever got heated up in Santa Monica, there was always a plan B, always. And I believe he had money out in Nevada and maybe even Utah under an alias name that we will never find out about. And because he would have fled Santa Monica, and I guarantee he would have went, he would have went toward where he had money and parked himself, somewhere else. And the money in Piccadilly was about 100,000 pounds, English pounds, and it just kept compounding interest, over the years. And to my knowledge, it still is, because the United States, per the court order from his conviction, is that all of the illegal proceeds have to be returned to the victims' families. And so there's money in Dublin and there's money in Piccadilly Circus that has to come back. It's a long process. It's a mutual legal aid treaty from government to government. And it's a long process through the State Department. But suffice it to say, that money is seized and it's just waiting to come back to the United States if it hasn't already. But I should notate too on the Paris money that Bob mentions is about a month after Bulger was caught, I was listening to all his jail calls in Plymouth County Correctional Center, and he had a conversation about a month after. There was a conversation with Billy Bulger, his most trusted brother, who, mind you, was the contact person for that Piccadilly account back here in the United States.
The president of the Massachusetts Senate.
Yep.
Has a contact for Piccadilly Circus safe deposit box under the name of an alias that his sociopath mobster brother was maintaining. Just to connect those dots.
Yeah, just chew on that for a minute.
Yeah.
Should never happen. Happen.
No. So he told Whitey that he was going on a Catholic Charities trip to Spain. And so I tracked his travel because I something didn't smell right to me. And I asked him about money in Paris, and he shut me down. He would not tell me. And because all throughout my time on the case, I always heard that he had parked money in Paris, but we couldn't find it. We did FinCEN checks. We did all the investigative stuff you could do to try and locate, money under an alias name. And so it had to be under another alias that he was using. So fast forward to Billy traveling, and he returns from Spain, but he transits through Paris and spends a little time in Paris and then comes home to the US. So as an investigator, you would come to the automatic conclusion that he went and he either wire transferred money home or something happened. I don't know, but something happened in Paris.
And it's also ties to Northern Ireland in front of the IRA.
The IRA.
And one of the ideas that maybe the IRA was hiding him in Northern Ireland, which I never really thought was a possibility because why would they want kind of attention?
Yeah.
But I don't know much about the IRA. It seemed to me like kind of implausible.
Well,
they would be on the hook for him.
Billy was good friends with Jerry Adams, who was the head of the IRA over there.
Yeah.
He would come to his house in South Boston, and they'd have tea together.
Right.
And so there was quite a relationship between the Bulger family and, early on elements with the IRA and trying to ship guns over to Northern Ireland back in the mid 80s. It's called the Valhalla. It was a fishing vessel where it was loaded with guns that were destined for Northern Ireland. And it was little known fact, the driver of the boat was an FBI informant. No, I'm sorry, another agency. Can't think of it right now. Not FBI, but he was an informant. And ultimately he was killed because of it. Because I believe the Irish Navy intercepted that boat and arrested all those guys and took all the weapons. But anyway, that was his connection. He was pre-fugitive, but Bob and I have talked about this many times. I'm sure there's more money out there, and that's one of the regrets that I had, is that we didn't get all of it. And I wanted every cent to be taken from him because it's the right thing to do. And he operated with impunity for so long that it's the right thing to do. And that's the only regret I have. Everything else was sunshine and roses.
It's an interesting way of putting it. Now, we normally close these things up round about the hour mark, but I make no apologies for shooting over a little bit because I've really enjoyed this conversation. Before we let you go, though, Bo, do you have any questions for these two gentlemen?
I don't have any questions. I'm ready to read the book. I'm excited, so I'll be ordering it today. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I hope you like it. It was a long work in progress for us. Took about 6 years between Bob working full time, I work full time. We could only work on it on nights and weekends, and he did the yeoman's work. He did the writing. The writing is all stylistic by him, and the story is mine though, which I thought was pretty cool to tell. And but it took me a while to kind of come up with the guts to actually put my name on a book. But so glad we did it.
It's a great combination. It really is. When Vic sent over your stuff and I was looking into you guys, I thought, wow, that is an unusual combination for two people who are going to write a book. But fantastic, because I'm sure when the FBI work with the media, there's some frustrations. And I'm sure when the media work with the FBI, there's frustrations on the other side. For the two of you to collaborate, I think that's fantastic.
And we had to submit the manuscript to the FBI. For review for them. They weren't looking for accuracy.
True.
So they don't endorse the book. That's just a standard thing they do. But they were looking to see if there were any investigative technique we were revealing. And they only read it about a year for them to review it, and they only asked for one tiny change. And I was really surprised. I thought there were a couple of things in there I thought might ring a bell, but they were fine.
Incredible. We had a guy on the podcast called Kenneth Strange, who's an FBI agent, and he wrote a book about his experiences. And he said exactly the same thing. He submitted his book to be reviewed, And the stuff that they asked him to take out was kind of like, why are they asking me to remove this? And then there were bits where he thought, there's no way I'm getting this past them. And they were fine with it.
That's exactly what happened. So there's information in here about where Whitey was after he left Boston, before he went out to California. And I'm going through it, and my jaw's just hitting the floor. And I can't believe it. And so there's some detail into where he actually was and how they could prove it. That's never been out there before. And some other things in there too that what led him changing direction. And also the role that Teresa Stanley unwittingly played in Whitey off of California. It wasn't for her and what her betrayal, her revenge. He probably would have stayed down in Louisiana his entire fugitive life.
Incredible. Well, I mean, I think we've given our listeners a taster there. We've given them a lot of information to go on. However, there's clearly more there to read. So I would definitely recommend you do like Bo's about to do and go order that book and give it a read. I'm off on my holidays as of Friday of this week, and I can promise you this, that's top of my reading list. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you both very much. It's an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's incredible. It's a fantastic story, and I can only look on with jealousy that you got that opportunity to sit there for 6 hours and speak to somebody like that. Because although he perpetrated some evil deeds, be able to hear what motivated him and just get a little glimpse inside his psyche, which he didn't give out, like you say, in the courthouse, must have been absolutely incredible. And it's one of those things that I think you should be very, very proud of having done.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It was fascinating to be able to. That is the singly most important interview I've ever done in my career. I stayed with the agency for 26 years. I thought I had done some really cool things. That was the ultimate. That was the pinnacle for me. Being able to interview a guy that you were chasing, that you thought was a ghost. And, in our book, this one title, there's one chapter titled Everywhere and Nowhere. And that's what we were dealing with, with him early on, is he looked like every man. And that's why he fit in Santa Monica, because he looked like every man. And a lot of transients out there, a lot of expats from other countries in Santa Monica. So he felt safe there. But I appreciate it. It was the most important interview I've ever done.
Amazing. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of bald men with white beards out there. It's very true. There's plenty of us. There's plenty of us to go out. Not all of them are as bad as him, though. I need to make that very clear for anybody watching this podcast. So, gentlemen, I'm going to close it up now and say thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute honor. And Bo, thank you very much for joining me presenting.
Bo, nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. I'll order the book. It'll be here Saturday.
Awesome. Awesome.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to close it up and say good evening, and we will be back next week when we'll be talking about something entirely different again. Good night.
Friends around the mic, kicking back, alright. Day turns into night, podcast in the spotlight. Sipping on that brew, talking all